All right, as we mentioned in the last video, as the Black Civil Rights movement made progress in the courts, there was work simultaneously going on the legislative front. The way they had to move to get that, though, was more problematic since they needed to get civil rights on the political agenda, and that is difficult to do in a system which discriminates against you from voting and therefore discriminates against your representation. So one of the ways that they had decided to do that, which we mentioned earlier, which I'll have a slide here in a moment, was they needed to use civil disobedience to gain the sympathies of the non-offending whites and the representatives, to give them their just due, to give them their equal civil rights. So they needed to provoke these confrontations where blacks were being denied equal rights. So one of the ways they did this was sit-ins. Another way they did this was when Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white man. You see her here being arrested for that very act. They're booking her, taking her fingerprints, the whole thing. So this is what's going on to try and gain momentum in the political arena. And to get black civil rights on the agenda. Now, as we said earlier, these early demonstrations were based on this idea of civil disobedience, or defying an unjust law and allowing an arrest while offering no resistance. We talked about Gandhi and what happened with them in India, the mouse on their back, and King said, "We are a mouse with an elephant on our back." Now, his proportions were off, but the idea is there. In other words, there was no way they were going to get this massive behemoth off them if they were to confront and fight. They needed to provoke instances where they were just claiming what should rightfully be theirs, and then showing how they were denied it. So what you see here, here's the second problem. Sorry for that click to add title on there. So the second problem was the protest movements unleashed were difficult to control. So there were a number of things going on. So you have the black civil rights movement, and they have this vision of what should happen. And then the rank and file members of the community, of the African American community, saw what was going on and thought, "Oh, I can participate too," and they began to be a little more militant. And so some of these demonstrations, these sit-ins, in a sense, became violent. And you get from 1964 to 1968, you get the long hot summers, this racial violence that was going on. And many whites were appalled by the violence, meaning when black civil rights demonstrations turned violence, and so they fought against concessions to, quote, the lawbreakers. So in short, there's this conflict between the agenda setting and the coalition building of the black civil rights movement. You see here, this happening in Birmingham. I'm not exactly sure if this photo is from it, but this is where it kind of all started out. Birmingham, Alabama. They'd use these high-pressure fire hoses to try and break up these sit-ins. A lot of pressure coming out of those hoses. See, and they would do stuff like this to break this up. But the ironic thing is, this began to build sympathy for the black civil rights movement. And so because of this, public opinion begins to change. There were a number of things that happened. For instance, the percentage of whites that were willing to allow their children to attend school that was half black increased in the South. In 1959, it was 15%, and by 1965, it had jumped to 40%. So things began to change. In the North, in 1959, it was already 62%. There wasn't much increase in 1965. It only increased to 65%, but you can see at least it's going in the right direction. It was already much higher than in the South, and well above 50%. There were other changes going on as well. So the media portrayed these white segregationists just as they were, and it gave the black civil rights movement a powerful moral force. So you've already seen the hose, the high-pressured hose. Attack dogs. Here you see German Shepherd attack dog, biting this young man. If you look really closely, see, he's just sitting there taking it. And if you've ever been bitten by a dog, you realize that it's painful. You can see the African-American young man here holding the police officer's forearm. He's not doing that to try and confront him anyway. He's just doing that to deal with the pain. I've been bitten by a dog myself. I've had other things done where all I can do was clinch to whatever was nearby to deal with the pain. And that's exactly what's going on. So he's doing exactly what the black civil rights leaders want him to do, just taking the abuse. And this gives the civil rights movement a moral force that just helped to change people's attitudes. Another thing that helped. Let me go back just for a second to this slide. There's some other stuff going on at the same time. Events like these led many blacks to participate in the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King, in 1960, King Jr., in 1963, gave his "I Have a Dream" speech to 250,000 there in the square in Washington, D.C. In the summer of 1964, 3 civil rights workers were murdered by Ku Klux Klansmen who were aided by a local sheriff. The FBI identified the murders as such, which galvanized public opinion that the Ku Klux Klan had done this. And no Southern leader could any longer offer persuasive opposition to federal laws attempting to protect these old kind of rights. In addition to that, what happened next, and this may seem ironic, but it was actually helped. It actually helped in helping blacks to achieve equal rights, and that is John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Here he's a president known to have supported civil rights, and when he was replaced by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, Johnson said, we're going to pass civil rights legislation as a memorial to this dead president. And Lyndon Johnson was an expert at pushing legislation through Congress. He had served in the Senate for years and years and years. He knew how to twist arms and cajole people to his will, and particularly you had all this stuff going on, and it was just the moment in history for this to happen. So that actually helped blacks achieve equal civil rights, him being assassinated, ironically enough. And then in 1964, you have Lyndon Johnson being elected in his own right with large majorities in both houses of Congress. And so this led to a couple things. 3 things, actually. In 1964, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination based upon race, color, or national origin. It also established equality in employment opportunities and created the EEOC. And it empowered it to investigate complaints of job discrimination. Congress also passed, now that Lyndon B. Johnson is elected in his own right, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so for the first time, African Americans had a real right to vote. It is said that the 15th Amendment gave them the paper right to vote, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave them the legal right to vote. And then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, which banned discrimination in rental or sale of most housing. Let me go back to the Voting Rights Act for a second. So the Voting Rights Act did more to secure the equal rights of African Americans than perhaps any other single thing, because now politicians have to court their vote. And when politicians have to court your vote, they listen to you. And so you can see here that things really began to change for African Americans. This was really the impetus. So when you see where civil rights is concerned, when you see why do you think African Americans complain, this was really the genesis of their freedom. That was less than 60 years ago. we've come some ways in 60 years. There's obviously still room to go, but you can understand arguably why they're upset. Now, other groups that have felt they have been denied equal civil rights, they have taken one of the reasons we study the Afro Americans here is because of the methods that they use to achieve equal civil rights. And what has happened, other groups who feel discriminated take those same approaches. They first try to go to the courts and get some equal civil rights in the courts, and then once society begins to change, then you see them using the legislative approach as well. One more slide and we'll be done. You will perhaps recognize this picture. You probably don't know anybody's names. The guy in the center, Tommy Smith. The guy on the right in third place, Tommy Smith was first place. Juan Carlos. It's either Juan or John. I can't remember which at the moment. I think it's Juan. Juan Carlos was third place, and the white guy in the front, Peter Norman. This was in the 1968 Olympics when this long, hot racial summers were going on. These guys, Smith and Carlos, decide they're going to do this Black Power salute. People tried to talk them out of it, including Jesse Owens, who was the first, who was the Olympic athlete that upset Hitler's plans to have the Germans dominate the I believe it was the 1938 Olympics. He tried to talk him out of it, but this was one of those galvanizing moments. And they were booed for it afterwards. It went quiet in the stadium in Mexico City when this happened. One person described it this way: you could have heard a frog piss on cotton. Now you see the white guy here. His name is Peter Norman. He wore a badge, an Olympic badge for the protection of human rights, and he looks oddly out of place here. But to me, this story provides a lot of hope. When Norman died, I believe it was 2006, when he died, these two gentlemen were pallbearers at his funeral. And I just think that is so cool. And it shows you that while we are certainly not perfect, we have come a substantial way. And I hope this lecture has been meaningful to you and informative. And that it's made you think. That it's made you think about who we are as a country, where we've been, where we've come from, and the distance we have to go. All right, that's it for now. Thanks.